Hello, my name is Nathan Swift. I'm a security cloud solution architect here at Microsoft. Today we are finishing up our security automation series, part 5. And today we're going to be diving into how to export the logic app that we've built and make it into an ARM template that we can do a one-click deploy to Azure button for, along with how to make a pull request to the Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub page so that it becomes part of the official workflow automation that customers can use. Hopefully by the end of this, you'll see how easy it is to take any of the logic apps that are kind of security automations that we've been talking about over the course of this video series, and see how easy it is to do all these steps to make it deployable for other customers or deployable internal to your organization. So let's go ahead and dive right into this. So what we have here is the quick logic security automation template expression of the logic app that we've been building. Triggers on an alert from Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and goes and looks for the last 14 days on the Azure resource itself that was triggered in the alert, and looks for anyone that's done anything to that resource. So in this case, if it's a virtual machine, anyone that's start or stopped the virtual machine, or updated a network security group to the virtual machine, or edited or added a disk to the virtual machine. We'll record that, and we're going to send that alert to not only the security operations folks, but also anyone that was found in the audit logs. So we've done quite a bit of work here, but now we're ready to dive into making this template exportable. So to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to go to the logic app, and we're going to click on an area called Export Template down here on the bottom of the blades near Automation. And this will allow us to look at the logic app as code. And so in just a moment, we're going to get all of that code here. And you'll see this logic app as code. We can see where we set that global parameter for the security operations email. And we can also see some of the actions that are in there. The for each loop, what we're doing in the for each loop, conditionally what happens in that for each loop. All of those actions that we had created in previous videos we're now looking at it as code, including the body of HTML body of that email that we're going to be sending. Speaking of that HTML body of the email that we're sending, if you were kind of interested in what that looked like, you can see here the email that was sent from the Microsoft Defender for Cloud alert. We can see some information around the attacked resource. So this was a virtual machine, Skynet, and then what we saw was digital currency mining related behavior detected on there. I have XMRig installed on that virtual machine and spun that up in a couple different ways to get this alert to generate. We get some additional information around the detection time, but last but not least, which is really nice, is a nice little URL link that either the security operations folks can click on, or the folks in the audit logs can click on just to review that information as well too. We'll take them directly to the security alert in Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So I'm going to just go ahead and copy this hyperlink just to show you. And then we can also see in the to field through the audit logs, we've got all the folks that were found in the 14 days of that audit log around the Azure Virtual Machine Skynet. So what we'll do here is we'll go ahead and click that link by copying and pasting it in this incognito browser. And we will be directed to the alert directly here. And so your security operations folks, or the folks in the audit log, can get some more additional information, maybe around username that was involved locally at the time of the XMRig application. We can see the suspicious command line. We'll get a lot more details around the prop PID, the account session IDs, everything that was kind of going on, and the related entities that were involved with the Microsoft for Defender Cloud Alert. We could even take some further actions. So maybe we need to trigger an automated response manually. So maybe we need to isolate that virtual machine. Or another workflow automation, or maybe open up a Jira ticket or get like a VirusTotal IP report if there was an IP address found in those entities. So quite a bit of stuff that we can do to kind of mitigate that. And then we'll get some additional information over here. And then ultimately, if we need to close the alert, we can go ahead and dismiss it. So that's no longer in an active state in our Microsoft Defender for Cloud alerts page. We can also do some additional information. Was the alert useful? So we can go ahead and provide information and feedback to Microsoft around that, and also as to why it was useful or why it was not. We can go ahead and provide that information. All this information collected from was this useful is very important, because the Microsoft Defender for Cloud engineering team will look at these emails as they come in, will look to tweak and tune the analytic detections that are being made, and may also reach back out to you for additional feedback about your experience with the product or around that specific alert, whether it was maybe benign false positives, or maybe the information was just creating too many similar alerts, right? So the team is very interested in getting that feedback. So always, from a security operations practice, when you're dismissing these alerts in Microsoft Defender for Cloud, be sure to use these "was this useful?" It helps tune the product further. So I'm going to go ahead and go back to the Logic app as code. And so now that we're at this stage, we're going to go ahead and use some tools to export this template to basically make this template a one-click deploy to Azure template. As the template is if we just copy and paste it into a JSON file, it's got too much information in it. It's not ready to be deployed, right? We can see some parameters already hard-coded in here. We can see some other stuff hard-coded in that we've got to kind of make it generic so that it's deployable for customers. And ultimately, the target of that is going to be the Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub page in workflow automation. And we'll go ahead and create kind of a new workflow automation called Notify ASC Alerts by Azure Activity. So to get started, what we're going to do is we're going to take, and I'm going to use Visual Studio Code, and you can use any kind of text editor that you like. So if you've got Notepad++ or something else, feel free to use that. And we'll go ahead and drag this over here. And we're going to go ahead and open up another code editor side by side here. All right, perfect. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into the Microsoft Defender for Cloud cloned repository I have on my desktop. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll show you here in just 1 minute what that's going to look like here. Let me get to the GitHub page. All right. So we're in the Microsoft Defender for Cloud, and it's formerly called Azure Security Center. And we're going to go into the workflow automations folder. And what we're going to do is we're going to find one of these notify ASC alerts Azure resource. And we're going to go ahead and copy the folder here. And with that copied version, we're going to go ahead and rename it. Just give it a moment here. And we'll give it a name like Notify ASC Alerts by Azure Activity, because we're using those audit logs. Okay. And so now that I've got that open, I'm going to go into that new folder that I just cloned and copied. And I'm going to go ahead and grab the Azure deploy JSON file in the README file and bring that over into my right Visual Studio GitHub page. And I'm going to go back and choose the workflow automation that I copied from, the ASC Alerts by Azure resource. And I'm going to go ahead and grab that Azure deploy JSON and README file and move that to the left side. So what I've done is I've basically set up the code editing environment really quickly so that I have the existing logic app that is generic, right? You can see here that the default values aren't hard-coded in. They're parameters that we're going to prompt when you deploy the logic app. And I've got the copied version, which I'm going to send the export template into here just very briefly. So to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pivot back to the logic app and back to the export template of that logic app. I'm going to go ahead and just copy the contents of this exported template with the hard-coded values in here, and go ahead and copy this. And now what I'm going to do is on the right side where I'm building this net new logic app, I'm going to go ahead and paste that in here. Right. So we'll get back to the logic app code here in a moment, but what we're going to do is update the README file for this new logic app, and we're going to update it so that it reflects the workflow automation name, which is going to be Notify ASC Alerts by Azure Activity. We'll update a little bit of the notes here. So the logic app for the workflow automation will notify, we'll update the verbiage here. Microsoft Defender for Cloud alerts. And now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and update a couple more things. So this logic app for workflow automation will notify Microsoft Defender for Cloud generated thread alerts to the RBAC and we're going to update this a little bit, and we can kind of cheat a little bit. I'm going to go back into the workflow automation and look at the recommendations by Azure Activity and look at their verbiage a little bit. We'll notify alerts to the recent users within the last 7 days, but it's 14 in our logic apps. So I'm going to go back to this guy and then thread alerts to. And go ahead, paste that in there. So generate thread alerts to recent users within the last 14 days. Okay, perfect. Now we're going to also update the URL path here for the README file. This is the URL path for the one-click to deploy to Azure button. So as we're looking at this markdown file code, it's equivalent to what we're seeing here, where we've got the little image of the deploy to Azure button and then the URL here going down to that. So let's go ahead and update that. By this Azure activity. And we'll go ahead and update it here as well. Paste by Azure activity. We're going to take just a quick look here about the post install notes. The Logic app creates a managed system identity, which we talked about in an earlier episode. It's used to authenticate and authorize. So we know it doesn't do that. It's a little bit different. To obtain Azure activity logs on the resource defined callers. So we're going to go ahead and just copy this here. And then go ahead and update that. And we're going to go ahead and save this README file. Now we have an updated version of the README file. Be sure to make sure you take your author and put that in there. And then now we're going to go back and forth between the templates to make these generic so that you can deploy them to Azure. So we'll go through each step here. The first part I like to do is grab the metadata area here. So we'll go ahead and copy that, and we'll go ahead and drop this in to the right side. Now remember, the right side is the Logic app that we're going to publish. We've exported the template from the Azure portal. It's got everything hard-coded in there. So now we're going to use the left side to make these parts generic and deployable and programmable for customers to deploy them. The next thing I noticed too is that we have a workflow name. Now you're going to notice these connection strings. We can actually delete these out of here. So I'm going to go ahead and just delete them out of here for now. And I'm going to use this Logic app name for the parameter. And this will be, when they go to deploy it, this will be the default Logic app name, the display name that will be used. So we were saying by Azure activity. All right. Now for variables, we're going to grab 2 variables as well. So we will grab this section here. We'll go ahead and copy and paste it. We'll come back to this a little bit, but those same kind of parameters that we deleted earlier, we're just going to make them variables for the connection, the API connection names. We'll go into that in a little bit here. Now the next part is the resources themselves. So in the ARM template, this is the actual Logic app that we're going to deploy. But the Logic app also deploys with it the API connections that we talked about in an earlier episode. So I'm going to copy those API connections and I'm going to bring them over here since they will need to be created and they will need to be called upon later. And we can see here one of the API connections is the Azure Security Center alert connection, and the Office 365 connection that we authorize to a mailbox. So I can scroll down a little bit further, and I scroll down as well too on the left hand side, and now I want to grab some stuff here that's going to help us. The first part is the tags, location, and name. And this is important because we're going to not hard code the region, or for the tag, we're not going to hard code who had built it in the Azure portal. We're actually going to make the logic app tag called security. The location will be wherever the resource group that this ARM template is being deployed into. We'll choose that location. And then we're going to use the logic app name for whatever, the notify ASC alerts by Azure activity here. Now, for the identity, right, we don't need to pass in a principal ID or tenant ID. We just need to say that it's a system assigned identity. And upon creation, it's going to go ahead and create the managed system identity in Azure Active Directory. So we won't have to do that step manually like we did in the Azure portal in an earlier video. When we use the one-click to deploy method, the ARM deployment template that we're doing, it's going to deploy with a managed system identity automatically, which is very nice. Now, one thing we do want to grab, though, is this depends on. If we try to deploy this logic app and these API connections are not created ahead of time, this logic app deployment will fail. And so to prevent that, we're using what's called a depends on in the ARM template. And it's basically saying, hey, do not start, or, typically when you deploy to Azure, an ARM template's going to try to deploy everything that's programmed as a resource. What it depends on lets us do is it just basically says, hey, there's some dependencies in this logic app. Those dependencies are these API connections that need to be created first before we try to deploy the logic app. So a lot of times when you deploy deploy ARM templates, sometimes you'll get these fail messages. It's typically because the ARM template doesn't have a good dependency or depends on structure in that ARM template, and there's some stuff that had to precede the deployment of another thing because of that tightly woven dependency. Now, what we're going to do here is we're going to update some additional things. We're going to see that there's a security operations email, and instead of hard coding it, right, we want the customer, or we want our, when we go to deploy it, someone to actually put it in at time of deployment. So we're going to create one more parameter value here. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this logic app here. And be careful with commas when you're in declarative JSON. This can cause problems. So since this is the last thing, I'm deleting the comma here within the object of parameters. So this time, instead of a logic app name, what we're going to do is we're going to call it a security operations email. So we'll go in here, a new parameter called security operations email, and your SOC email address at company.com will be the default value. That way, when someone goes to deploy it, they'll see that in there, and they'll put in their security email address. You can also put things like description in here, and you can see a telesense is kind of kicking in here. And so I could say some stuff like, hey, the description, this is your security team's email address that needs notification of defender alerts, right? And so you can use descriptions as well to bring these guys in here. So I'm going to put a comma again so that I don't cause that problem. So just remember, declarative JSON is really interesting because there's always a lot of nitpicky rules on syntax, and those commas can make or break a lot of ARM templates. All right, so back in here, what we're going to do is we saw earlier where the logic app name was grabbed from a parameter. At time of deployment, it's using this as a default value, but you could rename it for anything. So for here, what we're going to do is the default value for the security operations email is going to be the parameter that at time of deployment the customer or yourself will put in the email address of the security operations team. So that will pass in, which will then itself become that global parameter that we saw earlier. That's kind of hard-coded for all the email messages based off the Defender alerts, and that was in the designer mode. What we're filling out in the code here is applicable to that parameters area in the logic app. So as soon as this guy comes up, we will click on there just to show it. All right, now that's loaded here. So what we're doing in the code level is we are grabbing that parameter to put the security operations email address in. But ultimately, at time of deployment, it's going to go into here as that default value. So let me go ahead and we'll finish this up here. So if there were any other global parameters, we'll go ahead and program them so that they can be inputted back here under the ARM deployment parameters in the template. Otherwise, for the most part, we don't really need to change anything in the actual actions themselves. Just know that they are as code. So you can modify not only in the graphical designer, but you can go into the code editor and make these changes as code as well too. The very last thing that we need to do to make this ARM template deployable is the API connections. So you'll see this $ connections. So again, we're going to copy these two guys over. And instead of them being hard-coded in here with like the subscription ID and all that information, right, we need to kind of make this generic. We're going to bring them in and call them at time of deployment and bring in the subscription ID wherever these this ARM template's being deployed into, along with the API name as well that we've updated and changed. So what we could do here is go ahead and save this. So I've got now an updated README file. I've got an updated Azure deploy template that has now been made generic so that it can be deployed. And we did that by using an existing template, exporting from the Azure portal the template into here, and then copying and pasting snippets like we talked about to make it more deployable. So now that we have this, I've been working under the cloned repository under GitHub. So what we're going to do here is we're going to use GitHub Desktop. And typically what I do is if you're first using GitHub Desktop for the first time, you'll probably want to clone the repository from the URL. And you can do that by going into the Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub page or the Microsoft Sentinel GitHub page. And under code here, grab the Git file and copy this URL path to the Git file. Once you've grabbed that and post that in there, it will clone into your local desktop environment. And then you'll also want to publish this branch into your own GitHub. So don't necessarily want to be making changes directly from the Microsoft Defender for Cloud's GitHub page. You want to kind of use your own GitHub. So to kind of show you what that looks like is if I go into SwiftSolve's GitHub here, what I should see is a cloned repository from the Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub page. So once this goes in here and once I go into repositories, we'll eventually see the cloned repository. And let me see here if I can find this. Okay, perfect. And we can see here that it's public. So this is the one that I've cloned from. And so now when I'm working from, and you can see here it's forked from here, because I cloned it and then used my own login credentials for my own GitHub, I've got a forked copy of that official Microsoft Defender for Cloud repository. And so now if I'm making changes, I can publish the changes here first and then do a pull request back over to the official Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub. So just to show you what that kind of looks like here is after you've cloned the repository and you've created a branch from the main branch. So we may create a new branch, and new branch would come from the main branch. We would want to bring in those files that are going to be changed, the new README file and the new Azure deploy file that we've changed for this notify ASC alert by Azure activity. And I'll just give some notes around it. So I'm going to say new workflow automation. And I'll probably use that for the description, new workflow automation. And then I'll say something to the fact that basically it's this guy. We'll just go ahead and say, hey, notify ASC by alert, workflow automation, workflow automation. And then typically what I'll do is I will update the comments. And this actually reminds me, one last thing we did forget to change here as I'm thinking about it is the README file. We updated the description of what this logic app is doing. So within the Azure deployment template under the comments, we need to copy and paste that because this is still using the old comments from the left side of the code we copied from. So we're going to take the new comments from the README. We're going to put those in there. We'll do a nice file save all here. And then within a moment, GitHub Desktop will update those changes that we're going to publish. So I'll go ahead and put something like this in here. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to commit this branch to my own GitHub page. So we're going to see that here. And then I'm going to publish this branch to my GitHub page here. And you'll see these nice things hanging on, pushing to origin, all that fun stuff here. And then the final step of this process is to create that pull request. This is going to take me to my own GitHub page, which I'm going to authenticate to. And once this is signed in, here we go. We now have the open a pull request into the Microsoft Defender for Cloud. So I'm going to go ahead and create that pull request. So just a little information on creating that pull request. It's going to go through an automated review process and a manual approval process by some of the folks in the Microsoft Defender for Cloud product group team or the Microsoft Sentinel product group team. And this way, these folks ensure that the workflow automations, the assets that are being created in GitHub for Microsoft Defender for Cloud or Microsoft Sentinel, that they are curated and they're appropriate. They've got the right, deploy to Azure kind of methodology. And are up to code and up to a good standard so that other customers can use them. So that's why it does go through a manual approval process, because these things out on GitHub are highly curated. They also go through an automatic check process. And in this case, we're just making a single check to make sure that I've got my CELA requirements met. If this is your first time, you'll be prompted to accept a license agreement. You'll sign it, and then once you've accepted that CELA license, you'll pass through this automatic check. Now, one last thing I want to mention too is if you're building a logic app and sending this to Microsoft Sentinel, there can be some additional checks, and one of the gotchas, troubleshooting tip, is if your README file contains any type of URL that might have, let's say, like a language code in it, right? Like en.us, or we're going to pretend we're German here, and German country code. And so if you have like country codes in the URLs, in the README files, or anywhere in these files, they will fail that check. We actually do check for language codes in URLs because we want to, this is a global audience at Microsoft, and so we want to make sure everything redirects to that person's native language. So that's just one of the checks I've seen fail. I've seen other checks fail as well, but that's one of the more common ones that I've seen, is that you haven't accepted CELA, or you've got a URL and that URL has a country code in the URL path, and so it will fail that check. So now we just have to wait for one of these reviewers to go ahead and review it, and once they've done that, it will then become part of the Microsoft Defender for Cloud GitHub page. And the nice thing here is it will eventually show up under workflow automation called Notify ASC Alert by Azure Activity. Now, one thing here as well is in the workflow automation. As you've been following along, this has all been recorded for video format and posterity, but at the very bottom of the workflow page, it actually walks through the same steps we did in this video on how to contribute step by step. The parameters area to think about that you've got to change, the variables area that we were showing here, and then also the API connections that need to be updated for that. And so one last thing you may want to do if you're in the testing type of mood is you'll certainly can grab this template here and then test deploy this into Azure, the Azure portal here. So we'll go to portal.azure.com, and once this guy loads, we'll create a new resource. We'll just do something. If you just search in the Azure Marketplace for template deployment, this is another great way before you make the pull request. This is another great way to kind of test it. That way you're not sending a pull request of kind of a broken template. So this will actually kind of validate all this stuff for us. So go ahead and paste that guy in here. We'll save it. And then I'm just going to deploy it into a new resource group. C3. And then we'll go ahead and update that a little bit here. and we'll review and create. It's going to go through there. And already I can see that I've got an error in one of the ARM templates, template input parameter path, security operations email, line 26. So already I know that I'm going to have to kind of fix this and send another pull request through GitHub desktop before it becomes part of that code. So could not find member description on object of template input parameter. So what I think I'm going to do here is I'm going to go, is create this one more time. I am going to see if that's what's causing all the hubbub about. So let's build this in our own template editor. Let's make sure that that is indeed causing that problem. So I'm going to take out this description here. I'm going to save this. I'm going to choose that test me 3 kind of thing there. And then it's going to go through the ARM template validation. Okay, that's what that was. So I think what I need to do is I think I need to remove this description. There is a field that you can write notes into so that during the ARM template deployment, when you fill that out, there's like a nice little information bubble with those things. I'll have to look at ARM template just to see what that is, but apparently it is not description. So now that I've updated that change here and I'm going to remove that description here, I'm going to go ahead and save that. And now what I should see is under the GitHub desktop, I should have maybe one more change. There we go. There's the change that's occurring. We're going to remove the description. So I'm just going to make a little note, remove description, validate error, and then I'm just going to go ahead and recommit this guy again. We'll go through that same kind of flow and process. Push back to origin here. Hang on. We'll create that pull request, and it should then update the existing pull request that I have here. So indeed, there is the original deployment that we made 9 minutes ago, and then 23 seconds ago, here's the remove description that should update and do that. So, again, it's always good to run a validation before you do a pull request like I did. And then, to fully test it, we would actually go and review and create it as well, too. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the create button here. And that way we make sure that the deployment doesn't fail like it just did. And we'll have to troubleshoot this a little bit about that. So unable to process template language expression for usage details. It's a template violation on line number 34. And then on line 47. So we'll go back to the code here, and then we'll see line 34 and line 47. So that's the closing of the JSON here. So maybe there's a issue with the JSON. We'll have to look at this a little bit further. So I'll take a look at that and update the pull request. As you can see here, the process itself is very simple. Sometimes, though, however, we do have situations where the JSON is maybe missing a comma or something like that, or just some of the errors that you've seen here. So I really do enjoy building these automations. I really enjoy kind of teaching this stuff. So if you found this useful, and you found this series very helpful in kind of designing, building it, and troubleshooting it, and then making that pull request and sending it up to GitHub, please let me know. Comments below, like, share, subscribe. Add some comments. If there's something that you want to see from a security automation perspective, drop me a note on my contact information that accompanies this video. And I look forward to doing another series of videos, maybe some tips and tricks or troubleshooting around some logic apps or security automations or other stuff that I encounter from my week to week here at Microsoft. So thank you and have a wonderful day. Hey, this is just some post credits here. What I've done is I've found a little bit more about that error, so I'll just share that out here. So, some of those errors we were finding was I just was able to read the error a little bit more, and basically it was basically telling me to the effect that there was something called username. The template parameter username is not found. So if I go to redeploy this logic app, and I go back to edit this template, what I'm going to do is I'm going to look for username. And so there's some parameters called username in here. So let's see if I can find that parameter username. So there's a parameter called logic app name, but somewhere along here I was using a parameter username. So what I'm going to do is update that to logic app name. And I think I should be good. We'll go ahead and save this, and we'll go ahead in the template itself and update it. Save it here. Again, find that resource group we were deploying to. So test me 3. All right, review and create. And we'll go ahead and create, submit the deployment. All right, perfect. It deployed this time. And so we're going to go ahead and you'll notice this little trick here when you deploy a logic app from ARM template to the resource group. It takes about 30 seconds to a minute or so to show up in that resource group. There we go. And so now here is the deployed logic app security automation that we've built here. And you'll already see that, in fact, it does have its own managed identity now because of the way that we informed the deployment template. And we'll have to go through and authorize the API connections like we did earlier for Office 365 and the Security Center Alert. And so, with that, we should have a change here. And so we will say update params, updated params to use logic app name correctly. Go ahead and we're going to update the commitment here. And then we'll go ahead and push to origin. And then we'll create the pull request as well, so that we get the updated version here. So create pull request. And there it is. Here's the third where we're updating the parameters. And again, this hasn't been reviewed. It will eventually be reviewed and then allowed. So, anyways, thanks again. I'm just one of these people that go a little fast sometimes through this, but hopefully this has been helpful. I will catch you on the next video.